Please welcome President Minouche Shafik and the President of the Republic of Singapore, His Excellency Tharman Shanmugaratnam.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this World Leaders Forum at Columbia University. It is a special honor and pleasure for me to introduce our guests today. So let me begin by acknowledging President Tharman Shanmugaratnam of the Republic of Singapore, alongside his wonderful wife, Jane, and the Singaporean delegation. The reason it's particularly meaningful to me is that I have known Tharman in many, many incarnations. When I was at the IMF, he chaired the IMF committee, which was the committee of all the world's finance ministers during the financial crisis, and we had further encounters in various international economic fora when I was a central banker. And most importantly, he was a very loyal alumni of the London School of Economics, where I used to be president, where he met his wonderful wife, Jane, proving that a great university not just improves your mind, but can also provide a lifelong partner in a full-service mode. We've shared many, many meals in Singapore together and enjoyed many, many conversations, and I consider him a friend. I also wanted to thank our moderator, Fareed Zakaria, who's a best-selling author, Washington Post columnist, and host of CNN's Fareed Zakaria's GPS, who is famous for bringing insight into the events that shape our world. And finally, I wanted to recognize the co-sponsors of this event, Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, its Institute of Global Politics, and our wonderful dean, Keren Yarhi-Milo, who will be making closing remarks at the end of today's session. This World Leaders Forum also serves as a Gabriel Silver Memorial Lecture. It was established in 1949 at SIPA to promote greater international understanding and world peace. And couldn't we do with some of that now? The inaugural lecture was in fact delivered by Dwight Eisenhower in 1950 when he was Columbia University's president. President Shanmugaratnam is one of the most popular and successful politicians in his nation's history. He has held almost every important job in Singapore, and when he ran for his current post as president as the favored and respected frontrunner, he won handily with more than 70% of the vote. His popularity is based on a lifetime of service, grounded in leadership roles as finance minister and deputy prime minister. And he's also held high-profile positions in multilateral organizations, including the UN and the IMF. He is a little bit of a rock star among policymakers, and what makes him, I think, especially special is that he's both a practitioner and a scholar of policymaking, which is a very rare combination. He's here today to talk about building common ground, about the need, as he puts it, to build resilience and optimism in a time of great change and uncertainty. We should expect a thoughtful and incisive conversation about resilience, optimism, and respect between a very distinguished journalist and a longtime public servant and politician. Thank you, Mr. President, for coming here to engage with our students on these issues, and thank you, Fareed Zakaria and Dean Yarhi-Milo, for your participation in this conversation that is so urgently needed at this time. Thank you.
Ms. Minouche Shafik, President of Columbia University, Ms. Keren Yarhi-Milo, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, Ms. Merit Jano, Dean Emerita of SIPA, Mr. Fareed Zakaria, and ladies and gentlemen. I should just add that I've known Minouche for a long time, but through those different incarnations, one thing was constant. Minouche has unparalleled persuasive power in getting anyone to do everything, and in particular, getting people to do it together. That was the case at the IMF, that was the case at the LSE, and I'm sure that's going to be the case at Columbia. I was glad to be invited when I was first invited, which was some time ago, but I'm especially glad to be here at this time. We are at a profoundly important moment, wherever we are internationally. The world we knew is gradually unraveling, and there's no telling where this will end. And we first have to recognize where we are going wrong. As the basis for building optimism, we must first recognize where we are going wrong. And it doesn't really have to do with the major crises and wars and climate extremities at the moment. They are each tragic. Each of these wars, each of these offenses against humanity, each of these unprecedented floods and droughts are tragic as far as their human cost is concerned, as far as their economic costs are concerned, and as far as that further dent that they make in a global rules-based order is concerned. But it's not just about bad events and bad actors. We have to look deeper. We have to look deeper. We do have to look at the powerful, destabilizing undercurrents in the world we are in. Geopolitical, ecological, and social. What's happening in our own societies. Because if we keep ignoring those undercurrents, those often slow-moving undercurrents, we're just waiting for one crisis after another to come. We're responding to one crisis after another at great cost to human life, to livelihoods, and to the credibility of both democracy and the global order. So we've got to address those undercurrents. Geopolitically and geoeconomically, we are seeing the ebbing of a rules-based order. And it shows up in many regards. We do have more intense, more frequent, and longer conflicts in the world today. We do have greater threats to sovereignty, particularly for smaller nations. And we do have the continued fragmentation of what is a highly integrated global economy. And I emphasize highly integrated because fragmentation and weakening of a highly integrated economy comes at much greater cost than, let's say, if we were talking about the bifurcation of the old Cold War global economy, which wasn't particularly integrated. So this is going to come at great cost. And we have also a loss of faith in multilateralism, particularly on the part of the developing world. So we have to recognize that. We have to recognize what's happening within societies. They are more polarized than they used to be. And it continues. It used to be regarded as a developing country problem. It's now a problem across a whole range of mature democracies, that increasing pulling apart of people, whether distinguished by different education levels, different regions in which they live, different sense of identity, different ethnicities. That pulling apart is very troubling. And we have to recognize, of course, the ultimate existential threat we face and the undercurrents that are leading to accelerated global warming, the loss of biodiversity, and least recognize a global water crisis, a crisis of destabilization in the global water cycle. And the three together, global warming, loss of biodiversity, and a global water crisis, are going to lead to extremities on a scale that we haven't seen before. We've already had, just last year, the worst drought in human history, in fact in China, the worst floods in human history in a few countries, and the worst wildfires. And that will carry on, but it's not the shocks that we have to attend to, but the undercurrents. And dangerously, each of these undercurrents, geopolitical, domestic, social, and ecological, are at risk of crossing tipping points, which means crossing a point at which you get irreversible change, self-amplifying changes, and with a very high degree of unpredictability as to where we end up. And that's why I say we are now in an era of radical uncertainty, not just high risk, not just something you can model and say, well, look, this is a bad scenario, and we'll have to find a way of hedging against it, but profound uncertainty, profound unpredictability, because we do not know where this will end. And they're compounding each other. The geopolitical, the ecological, and the domestic dynamics, social and political, are compounding each other in ways which make this a complex problem and one that cannot be addressed through our conventional solutions, multilaterally, or solutions within democracy in a business-as-usual way. And our central task has to be to build resilience and optimism at this time of radical uncertainty, and to address and roll back the undercurrents that threaten to lead us into a place that we don't know, but could be a very bad place. And there are ways of addressing it. There are no perfect solutions, but there are bold actions which are still within our reach to prevent us crossing these tipping points and to roll back those forces leading to a radically uncertain world. Geopolitically, the US-China relationship is central. That's the central axis of tension that will determine whether we keep spiraling down or we stabilize. We know we are not in a unipolar world anymore, but we are not yet in a truly multipolar world. And we are certainly not in a world of stable multipolarity. It may take some time. But in the meantime, the US-China relationship does require stability. The recent meeting between President Biden and President Xi hints at a thaw, and at the very least a pause in that trajectory of worsening relationships. But it does not address a more fundamental source of tension, which is that technological and economic competition between the US and China, which still lacks equilibrium. And it will have to be found. Some new accommodation will have to be found between the US and China, and some new basis for strategic trust. Second, we have to find ways in which, around the world, leaders see peace as essential to the interests of their own people, and see peace as only possible if you acknowledge and respect what the other side needs. There will be no peace without an end to terrorism and extremism, but there will also be no peace without solutions which are equitable and that provide hope for all sides. Thirdly, the environmental. Or secondly, the environmental. I'll be brief here, but we've got to get past the old way of thinking, which is not so long ago. 2 decades ago, we still thought of dealing with the environmental crisis and climate change as involving some sort of trade-off. You pay a cost today in order to have a better future. Sustainability requires sacrificing something today, sacrificing some growth. That was the old thinking. But we now know that there is no true trade-off if we invest in solutions, invest in new technologies, invest in new models of growth in the developing world as well as in the advanced world. Invest industry by industry. And remember, most of that investment isn't in green sectors. It's in all the sectors of the economy that must now make a transition from brown to gray, from gray to green. And that transition story requires higher levels of investment over a longer period of time. But it can be done, and it means we can keep growing, particularly in the developing world, whilst we at the same time decarbonize the global economy. The idea of trade-off and sacrifice today in order to solve this problem for the long term is one that we should shed. And we have to move into the investment mindset of investing in the solutions that will allow us to have sustainable growth. And there is no lack of resources for this, by the way. There is no lack of resources in the global financial system for us to mobilize. It requires organization, it requires reforming multilateralism, and it requires a spirit of risk-taking between the public, private, and philanthropic sector, and with equitable sharing of risks and rewards. It can be done. Third, domestic, which is our core problem. Our core problem really is in domestic social and political dynamics. When Angela Merkel said in 2010 that we had utterly failed in multiculturalism, what she meant, and what we have to interpret her as meaning, was not that multiculturalism failed, but integration failed. And indeed, across too many societies, we have utterly failed in integration. And that's one dimension of it, ethnic integration, immigrant integration. But the broader dimension of it has to do with the growing unfamiliarity of people with different educational levels, who have different professions, who are in different walks of life, or who live in different parts of the country, cities, suburbs, rural areas, that growing distance between people, and that gradual loss of trust amongst each other and trust in the institutions of democracy, including government. It can be addressed. It requires leadership, but it also requires reform to democratic practices and institutions, so that we don't get that continual fraying at the seams. We have to move away from a concept of multiculturalism that was about a quilt of different colors, even different threads in each of the patches, towards a concept of multilateralism, a multiculturalism that is about threads that together weave the fabric of society, without separate patches that over time are vulnerable at their seams. We've got to weave that entire fabric with all the threads of that society, of each of our societies. And underpinning it all, underpinning this rebuilding of optimism and resilience, and this rolling back of the forces that are leading to radical uncertainty, has to be a reorientation of multilateralism in an imperfect world, in a world that is not yet in a stable multipolarity, but it is no longer unipolar. And we have to find ways in which we build coalitions of the willing to address the most urgent challenges of the global commons and to preserve rules of the game, open-ended coalitions of the willing. There has to be a way in which we avoid the worst offenses to humanity. So we have to reorient multilateralism, not around the ideal, and there was actually never an ideal in multilateralism. It was never constructed to be strong. But today, the demands on multilateralism are greater than ever before. and the supply is weaker than ever before. And we have to reorient ourselves as nations, but collectively reorient ourselves to address the common challenges that we face. And in democracies, we have to also reorient democracies so that we are less short-term, less insular, and less divisive in the practice of democracy. And it can be done. It must surely be possible for each society to recognize that it is in its own interests to invest in the global commons, because we're all going to be affected by the weakening of the global commons. It must be possible to recognize that it's in our own interests to invest in the long term today in a fair and progressive fashion, rather than pile up an even larger burden in the decades to come. And it must be in our own interests to find ways in which democracy bridges differences rather than widens them. And we have to do this remembering that we are in a world where we are very easily pulled apart within our own societies and internationally. And it will require reorientations, fundamental reorientations in how we go about democracy and how we go about international cooperation and multilateralism for us to prevent that pulling apart and allow us to come together to address at least the common challenges we face, even if we know there are differences between our systems and there are differences in our views. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to unpacking some of this with Farid. Thank you.
So I will begin by noting that I think it is about 25 years ago now that I was in Singapore, and I had begun a practice, came out of a long interview I did in Foreign Affairs, of every time I was there, spending a few hours with Lee Kuan Yew, who was at that time the senior minister. And he says to me at one point, we're talking about education, and he says, we've got this bright young Indian Minister of Education. You have to meet him. And I thought, okay, I'll do my homework, and I asked my friend Kishore Mahbubani if he would set up a meeting with the then young, bright Minister of Education, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, who has, of course, ascended to higher and higher stratospheres ever since. And it has been an enormous pleasure to see, both in Singapore but in the world, the way that you have been able to establish yourself as a genuine statesman intellectual, which is very rare. The Singaporeans amended the constitution to allow you to continue to hold a series of important international positions at the UN. And I'm hoping that that amendment also means that you will be able to speak freely and frankly in a way that most heads of state don't. So let me test that proposition right away and say, you describe very well the fraying of the international order. And you can look at Russia, Ukraine, you can look at what's going on in the Middle East, you can look at China's challenges. But what is the solution? Because on the one hand, the solution seems to be that the United States essentially use hard power to deter, combat, reverse these efforts to fray the international order. But of course, in doing that, it divides the world more. It forces countries to pick sides. It makes it more difficult to imagine a kind of consensual world in which everyone comes together and sings Kumbaya. But if you don't do that, the Russian aggression stands. Iran's efforts to unravel a Middle East order continue, and China's efforts to, frankly, bully a lot of Asian countries continue. How do you thread this needle, which is, in order to in order to sustain a world of law and economic commerce and the kind of things you're talking about, it seems like you need some very tough, hard military power, or at least hard power at the back of it.
Well, I think, can you hear me? Yeah. Let me take this angle in responding to Farid's very thoughtful and I should say difficult question. First, it's very hard to summon up trust within the international community only when you need it most. It's very hard for the US to summon up enough support from the developing world only when you need a vote in the UN on Russia-Ukraine. It's very hard to summon up support for everyone to both condemn Hamas's terrorist acts as well as to express umbrage against the indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Gaza. It's very hard to just summon up trust in the global community when you need it most. You've got to do it by addressing the needs of nations in normal times. So everyone in the developing world remembers what happened during COVID, the gross inequity in the distribution of vaccines, vast overstocking in the wealthiest countries. Everyone remembers the fact that we've just underinvested in the basics of development. Everyone remembers that the World Bank and other development banks have been undercapitalized, mainly because the existing largest shareholders don't want to see a change in shareholding, which will come about when China and the emerging world take on larger shares. And that's the only way in which you increase the capital of the institutions. So without getting into the technical details, people know that, look, you're only going to call upon them when you need them most. And it doesn't work that way. Trust doesn't get built that way. So I would say, start from where countries are, look at their needs, and find ways of organizing ourselves multilaterally or through coalitions to address those needs. And the point is, it's not actually expensive. It's not as if these resources can't be mobilized. They can be mobilized. There's no lack of financial resources and expertise in the world to address the needs of the very large block of developing nations. It's just a matter of neglect.
We are almost certainly not going to have a kind of perfect world of international cooperation around things like climate change, some of the other ecological challenges you described. I would argue regulation of something like artificial intelligence. We're just not at a moment of US-China, let alone US-Russia accord, right? Where we're going to say, we're all going to sit around a table and decide these are the things we will do in AI, these are the things we won't do. We're going to sit around a table and come up with an agreement on carbon emissions. Is there a viable plan B that is actually not too bad? And the reason I ask is because, let's face it, this is the world we're going to live in, not plan A. And is plan B, where China does what it needs to on climate because it feels it wants to reduce emissions because it doesn't want to have pollution, it also wants to build up the green energy sector, others do the same, India trying to do that with solar, China reining in AI for its own reasons, the US and Europe doing it for, and there's a certain kind of unspoken, what I would call stealth global collaboration. Nobody will admit that they're cooperating, but that is in fact what's happening. Is there a world there that we can imagine? Because it does feel to me that's the best we're going to get.
So I think one way of addressing Farid's question is, what's the alternative to plan B? Plan A doesn't exist for all the reasons you've described. Multilateralism is not functioning very well. the US and China still don't see eye to eye on fundamentals of technology and economic supremacy. And there are many other reasons. The real alternative is Plan C, where we carry on as they are, and then if you're looking at the climate crisis, at some point, which I think will happen even before 2030, at the very latest 2035, the situation would have got so grave because we would have crossed certain tipping points that governments will have to get together and say, let's stop fooling around. Let's stop fooling around. We're going to have to do something now. And it's going to be far more expensive then, but something will have to be cobbled together. It'll be highly inefficient. It'll be a situation where some countries have much higher carbon taxes than others. Some have much larger subsidies than others. But it's going to be extremely expensive and probably quite unfair. So Plan B, which is what you were talking about, where we don't wait till 2030 or 2035 and stop fooling around, is where we accept now that realistically, under any scenario of who wins the next elections in the United States or the next time round, you're not going to get a system of carbon taxes in the US. They don't even have a goods and services tax. But the subsidies that are part of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, the very large subsidies for green technologies, are things which economists don't like, because that's not the first best solution, but they are going to help build scale in new technologies. It's a little unfair to other countries. It even looks protectionist. It is protectionist, but it's going to build scale in new technologies. And you need that scale investment to come down the cost abatement curve and make new green technologies viable in ways that the rest of the world will eventually benefit from. It may lead to a subsidy race. Developing countries aren't going to be able to engage in it. Even Europe is probably not going to be able to engage in this on the same scale of subsidies as the US. But it's better than Plan C, because Plan C is a waiting game. It's better to go down that cost abatement curve now, invest now in getting scale, the same way that it was done in solar. If you look at what China did in solar, as well as wind, to bring the cost down so significantly through initial subsidies and going for scale investments. Look at what Germany did as well. Look at what's necessary to get technologies viable. They're not going to get there the way economists would like, where everyone goes up to a $150 carbon tax as soon as possible. That's theoretically the most efficient solution, but it's just not going to happen. So we've got to find some ways in which countries that can afford it move ahead. At some point, the US is going to need a new fiscal strategy and a revenue strategy to sustain its subsidies, but it's doing the right thing now, and the world will benefit for it.
So let me outline what I think is quite plausible in terms of the kind of world we're going into, which is a world in which there is an even greater, if you think you've seen inequality, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because between AI and computing power and the access to the kind of scale of energy you need, the US is going to be in a league of its own. China is going to be second. There are going to be a few other countries. Frankly, I think Europe gets left behind in many ways. Europe is deindustrializing as industries move to the US, because they get not only subsidies, they get lower taxes, they get lower regulatory structure. And as you say, global warming is already upon us, and the cost of adjustment is one that will only be able to be borne by rich societies, so that New York City will be able to build dikes. I mean, the Dutch did it in the 16th century. Bangladesh will not. And you know what? For those who think we cannot sustain the kind of human tragedy that this involves, I mean, I have news for you. The Syrian civil war, you know, I mean, you'd be surprised at the extent to which the world can sustain all this.
Or Sudan.
Or Sudan right now, or, you know, Ethiopia, Yemen. Why is that not the most plausible scenario? A world of much starker inequality, and that we might look back on the 20th century as actually a kind of golden age where the late 20th and early 20th, first century, you saw a narrowing of global inequality, but it's about to turn pretty sharply.
Well, I think it's not plausible because inherent in the global commons, whether it is global warming or all the other consequences coming about from deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and the imbalance in the use of water, is that everyone is going to be affected by it. So what happens in Bangladesh, what happens in sub-Saharan Africa, what happens in parts of the world that are very far away from Seattle or Washington are eventually going to affect the global climate. And that is the fortunate part of it. That's the fortunate part of it, that the crises are going to start coming everywhere in the world. Droughts, floods, wildfires are all caused by that ecosystem going out of balance. Now, the challenge is for democracies to recognize that solving it isn't just a matter of picking up the pieces each time there's a wildfire, but helping sub-Saharan Africa. And that's a real challenge in democracies, to recognize that something far away is in your interest to try to address and try to remedy. And something that's a little further in the distance, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, even 50 years from now, it's in our interest now to start preparing for it and trying to avert it. And democracies were never wired that way. They were never wired to look at the long term, and they were never wired to look at the global. They were always about finding some consensus domestically for a relatively short period of time. So rewiring democracies for the long term and for the global challenges that we all face is a central challenge.
You look at one piece of polling data out of Europe that I've always thought is so telling, which is when you ask people whether they are comfortable with higher and higher levels of welfare spending, it relates inversely with the degree of heterogeneity of the population. In other words, the more people look like you, the more comfortable you are with high levels of welfare spending. The more people don't look like you, you don't like the idea of welfare spending. And it gets to exactly your point, which is that democracy and liberal democracy is much easier in a circumstance where the community is one that is very easy to identify and identify yourself with and empathize with. And it relates to the last thing I want to ask you before I open it up. You said something very interesting about multiculturalism and how it failed. And I want to ask you to think about the way to make multiculturalism work, because you said Merkel's version was integration and it didn't work.
It didn't have enough integration.
Right.
It was basically a diverse quilt.
Right. Now, when I would ask Lee Kuan Yew what made multiculturalism work in Singapore, he would always say, and you know this because it's the diverse quilt, not quite that, but he would say, look, we have these communities, but we let them be. We want them to retain their old traditions. We don't want them to feel that they have forced into us. They have to live together. They have to learn how to live together in the housing projects. But we want them to continue to learn their languages. We want them to continue to have their traditions. And we want them to meet in a civic space. What you are saying is you want a quilt that's woven with the threads of each of these traditions. Now, I happen to think you're right in the sense that that old model is not really available anymore. Modernity is pushing everyone forward to an extent that you can't have, these communities staying completely. I mean, for one thing, intermarriage rates, even in Singapore, are rising much, much higher. You yourself have a multicultural marriage. What is the old model for Singapore seems to me one that isn't going to be applicable if you have 40% intermarriage, where you are forcing a kind of weaving. So then the great challenge that the Merkels of the world face is, how do you create a common culture? And the one country that has an answer here is the US, because we have no culture. We had a shared set of political ideas that you have to buy into. There is, to be fair, you know, my old station advisor, Sam Huntington, would say, behind all that, there was a kind of Protestant English, you know, subculture that you had to buy into. You know, we just went through Thanksgiving. That is not a Greek festival. That was a festival of Englishmen who came here. But there's largely a political culture that you're trying to get people to assimilate around. In Europe, that was not what made European countries. What made European countries was the idea, this tribe has lived here in these forests for age immemorial, and by the way, killed the tribe that lived on the other side of this forest for age immemorial. And what you Algerian are doing in this forest, I don't know. And that has been the problem for the Europeans, right? So what's your solution?
So I think I half agree with Farid on this. Singapore never went for a melting pot concept of multiracialism. But neither did we go for the quilt of diversity in different patches, live and let live. You live in your own neighborhoods, like they do in the banlieues in Paris. You grow up in different schools, and you have your own practices, but you sing the same national anthem. We didn't go for that either. We actually went for a very intrusive model of integration, combining the school systems into one national school system. Everyone attends the same schools. Most intrusively, everyone lives in the same neighborhoods. Same housing block, same apartment blocks, same precincts, same markets, same bus stop that you wait for the bus at, same playgrounds your kids mess around in. That was a very intrusive system of integration, and that was Lee Kuan Yew. So the fabric of Singapore society was woven by all those threads, but he recognized and we recognize that they are different threads. They're different threads. They're different colors, even different materials, but you want them all to form the common fabric of society. Europe went for a quilt, and it looked very good initially because it was a vibrant quilt. The diversity was very apparent, but the moment you start getting pulls on that fabric, coming from outside your society or from within, what phrase are the seams between each of the patches? Even Britain, which was far more integrated than Europe, even in Britain, 50% of all Muslims live in the bottom 10% of neighborhoods. It's not an integrated society. And then you come to the United States, seemingly integrated because it lacks sort of a common ethnic culture, as it were. But there is segregation. There's segregation by neighborhoods, that's systematic, and as a result, there's segregation by schools. It's socioeconomic and it's ethnic. And the rules are systematic, preventing housing integration. So wherever we are, and we can't really lecture each other on what's necessary because we come from different histories, Singapore, by force of an unusual start to nationhood, went for a very intrusive approach of weaving those threads together into a common fabric, but recognizing that they were different threads. And people did want to retain their own sense of identity, religion, faith, a sense of your own culture, because it gave you some meaning in life. But you were part of a common fabric of Singapore society. And more, I do feel, as we go forward as a country, we've got to make sure that people don't just see themselves as persons of different races and religions, but increasingly see themselves not just as Singaporean and nationality, but as sharing each other's cultures as well, taking an interest in each other's cultures, speaking a bit of language. You don't need to be able to write, maybe not even read, but speak some of each other's languages. Most importantly, grow up together, make friends with each other. You might get married or not get married with each other, to each other, but you're friends. And Singapore can do that. We can do that, but it would not have been possible had we not had that model of integration from the start.
Yep, yep.
Schools, housing, workplace.
Very interestingly, this was the Johnson administration's effort during the fair housing policies, and it hit a wall of white resistance. And if you look at housing in America, it gets integrated till about 71, 72, when the white backlash becomes pretty strong. Nixon recognizes it, plays on it, and we are at the same level of housing integration in this country since then. Since 1971, we are no more integrated today than we were then.
Even in the liberal-leaning states.
Even in the liberal-leaning states. Let's have questions. We're going to bundle them together, so my request is line up. I think there are mics. Ask your question. Please do not give a speech, because be fair to the other people asking questions so that they get a chance. We're going to take sort of 3 at a time, and then the president is going to try and relatively quickly answer them, because we really do want to hear from you, but we want to hear from you briefly. The lady with the MIT t-shirt, which is an act of disloyalty right away.
No. I lived in Cambridge before. Good afternoon, President Shandaman. I'm Yajie from the MPA Global Leadership Program of SIPA. Welcome you, your wife, and your delegation come to Columbia University. Originally, I'm from China. I have 2 questions. So
you get to ask one. Ask the first one, yeah.
Okay, so what will Singapore do if there is a military conflict between China and Taiwan?
Try to duck and take cover, sir. You, yeah.
Hello. So it's my turn. So she got ejected. Okay. Okay. So Majula, Singapore. Yeah, I'm from Singapore. So I'm Singaporean. My name is Benjamin Tan. So today I have one question. I have a few, but I think I focus on one. So in an era where technological advances and global interconnectivity are reshaping our society, so what are your thoughts on how younger generations like us can be more empowered and prepared to not only adapt to these changes, but also play a proactive role in fostering a more harmonious, equitable, and sustainable global future?
Great. Sir.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Mr. President. I'm Hong Yizhou from Columbia SIPA. And actually, I have a question for you. So we all know that Singapore has a strong commitment to upholding international regulations and also multilateralism. But we can see the global deglobalization trend has already happened and bring us a lot of challenges. So how do you envision the role of Singapore did can promoting the regional cooperation, and what kind of commitment or efforts you have already did to promoting such goals achievement? Thank you.
All right. What will you do if China attacks Taiwan? What should young people do? How do you reverse deglobalization?
Good. In descending order of difficulty. So on Taiwan, first of all, as you know, Singapore believes in a one China policy, and we've been consistent about that through the years.
But you do military training in Taiwan.
We do, and we are in the unusual position of having very strong relations with both China and Taiwan, which are understood by both. Now, how we react if there were to be a conflict depends on how the conflict came about. But I would say more fundamentally that there's too much of a parlor game now of people trying to predict, is China going to attack Taiwan? Is it 2027 or 2035? What are President Xi Jinping's real objectives? There's too much of that parlor game. The fact of the matter is, every serious observer knows that neither China, nor Taiwan, nor the United States wants a conflict. That's very clear. And we've got to do everything we can to prevent any provocation or accident that could provoke a conflict. That's the task. That's the task. The task is to abide by the interests of both the US and China in not wanting a conflict to take place. And fundamentally, that means no move to Taiwan independence. That's the red line for China. So, second question, which is a broad question about technological advancement. It's actually a very interesting question, and it goes back to something that Farid was talking about. I think AI is going to be transformative in ways that previous waves of technological advancement, well beyond previous waves of technological advancement. Because AI can be very empowering for the small enterprise, for the individual, anywhere in the world, including the developing world. But the challenge we face with AI is that a significant part of the white-collar cognitive class, people doing auditing work, legal drafting, a whole set of tasks in medicine, a whole set of white-collar jobs, can have their jobs done much more easily, faster and cheaper by AI. And that's happening today at an accelerating pace. So we've got to find ways in which we re-empower every individual. First, to be able to use AI as a tool, but second, if they do lose their jobs, because some will lose their jobs, to be able to move on to something else. And the societies that succeed in an AI era are those that are going to have the ability to invest continually in people, including in the middle of their career or even at the later stages of their career. That's what we've embarked on in Singapore. We call it Skills Future. But it requires continuous investment, not just leaving it to enterprises and individuals to sort this out. It requires a national approach. It requires some public investment, and it requires constant niftiness as you move from one job to another, retaining some of the skills you've built before and trying to apply it to a new area. There will be a premium on the intrinsic human skills, everything to do with EQ and some forms of creativity that are still beyond the most intelligent machines. There will still be that premium. But I believe that this much more large-scale adjustment in workforces and in societies is going to be necessary this time round, because AI is not just about computers and the internet revolution. It goes well beyond that.
In a sense, what you're saying is these people, these kids won't lose their jobs to AI. They'll lose their jobs to somebody who knows how to use AI better than they do.
Yes, no, that's quite right. But it is profound implications, because it means as you grow up from young, you've got to remember that you've got to develop in every possible way that very human activity of interacting, understanding, sensing each other, emotively associating ourselves with each other, all summarized as EQ, because it's the EQ that the machines can't do. And if they do it, they'll do it in a more robotic fashion. Third question on deglobalization and regional cooperation. In this imperfect world, one of the ways in which we keep global integration alive is through regional initiatives. We're doing it in Asia, and in fact, as you know, Singapore's very much at the forefront of that, both within ASEAN, within the RCEP, as it is so called, a very large trade alliance, although not as deep as the CPTPP, and of course the CPTPP, which is a very high standard free trade agreement. So we are pushing very hard in Asia, more than most other regions, but we are keeping the boundaries open, keeping the geometry open and not fixed. The UK is joining the CPTPP, very likely by the middle of next year. It's an open trade alliance, but it's one way of keeping global integration afloat. It's not closed regionalism, but open regionalism. And that's very much the attitude we take in Singapore.
All right, let's go. Sir?
Thank you very much. It's been a very enlightening and inspirational talk. My name is Adam DePico. I'm from Australia, your distant neighbor. My question today is, you speak to consensus as being the underlying mechanism to dealing with such undercurrents. The path forward, by your words, is clear, but the stewardship is not. So my question is, how do we foster engagement and consensus in the global south with so many of the needs in that part of the world unmet? How do we create a framework for inclusivity where this concept of consensus can then be broached? Thank you.
Hello, Mr. President. My name is Shiri, also from Columbia SIPA. I have a question about the aging population, and also talked to the Mr. Deputy Prime Minister Wong last year in Singapore about this. Since Singapore is going to be a super aged nation by 2026, so I was wondering like how Singapore is going to keep the balance between the aging population and the immigration issues and the development of labor market. Thank you.
Sir?
Thank you so much for the talk, sir. My name is Devraj from the MPA program at SIPA. My question is about tipping points and how they can often be very abstract and unreal for common populations. So what is the role of governments and academia in making these tipping points real for people so that a real action can be taken on them?
Good. On your first question about the developing world and how we build consensus, consensus in favor of multilateralism, consensus in favor of, let's say, market-based economic development. First, the whole world has to recognize that what happens in sub-Saharan Africa is in all our interests. We're going to see a very large increase in the world's population in the next 30 years, and most of it is going to come from sub-Saharan Africa. Most people don't realize that. Most of the increase in the world's population is going to come from sub-Saharan Africa. It's a huge bulge of the young population that is coming up there. And if they get jobs, and decent jobs, then the world remains a peaceful place and a prosperous place. If they don't, then you get a new element in the radical uncertainty I was talking about. Forced migration, outbreaks of global health disorders, and a whole set of other problems, So we've got to invest in Africa using the World Bank, using the African Development Bank, using the private sector, and ensure that that large part of humanity is able to get on a ladder of prosperity. And if we don't do it, it's very hard to expect them to have a consensus in favor of global challenges. If you don't provide basic electricity, which is now lacking in most of Africa, you can't really talk about decarbonization and renewable energy. You've got to first electrify the villages. You've got to deal with the basics. So we've got to, the traditional developmental objectives, helping every country get on its feet, get on that ladder of prosperity, are still the basis for global prosperity. And there are ways of organizing it. It's not very expensive. It just requires a willingness to know that this is an investment we all make, and it's not about aid, it's about investment. On the next question about Singapore becoming a super-aged society and the role of immigration, we will have to continue to rely on immigration, but we'll have to do it at the right pace and the right quantity of immigration. No society can open its borders to people. It's different from goods, it's different from services. As Farid was hinting at earlier, no society can be completely open to people from all over the world. You've got to do it at a measured pace. And critically, you've got to integrate people. And if you're unable to integrate people well, you just have to stop. You can't keep taking in more and more people. So Singapore's emphasis is on both a measured pace of immigration for people who are able to contribute to the economy, but importantly, find ways in which they can be integrated, and for those who can settle down, to help them settle down. It must remain a country where Singaporeans feel this is their own country, with a Singaporean ethos, Singaporean ways of going about things, and a certain Singaporean egalitarianism in the social sense. We've got to stay that way. Did I miss the last point, or have I answered all three?
I think that was all three, right? Was there a last question that Dev Das, you asked the last question.
Devraj, sorry. I asked about tipping points and how, because they're so abstract and not known to common populations, how do we make them more actionable?
Got it. So I think the way to think about it is about we're in a world today that is no longer about economics being about cycles, and you've got central banks and ministries of finance trying to manage that cycle. You have a boom that's getting too hot, you tighten monetary policy, you contract fiscal policy, and things come back down to normal. If you're in a depression, you find ways of boosting government spending, lowering interest rates, pumping in more money. That was a cyclical game. But the challenges we face in the world today are not about cycles. They're not about macroeconomic cycles. They're about what the economists call supply-side shocks, but even that sounds like an abstraction. What they're really about are conflicts and wars, pandemics, floods, droughts, and other things that are quite separate from macroeconomics. But macroeconomics has to respond, and the way to respond to it is to think more long-term. Don't wait for crises to come. Invest early to prevent and prepare for crises. Because if you just keep waiting for crises to come, they're extremely expensive. And secondly, they exact an unacceptable impact on human life. So the fair thing to do, the progressive thing to do, and the financially prudent thing to do is to invest early to prevent and prepare. And the classic is when it comes to global health. We know the next pandemic is coming, and we're still flying blind into it, by the way. We're flying blind into the next pandemic. A whole system of global surveillance hasn't been set up. Global sharing of data hasn't been set up. Africa is still lacking, and other parts of the developing world, many other parts of the developing world, are still lacking the basic infrastructure of primary health care required so that when the time comes, you know you can ship vaccines with some sort of cold storage into every village and town and get it into someone's arm. We still don't have that infrastructure. It's not expensive. We just need to get down to it.
All right, we're going to take lightning rounds of really fast questions. So.
Thank you, President. My name is Eric. I'm an MBA student from Columbia Business School. We're now at a new frontier of technological innovation, which is artificial intelligence, which you've mentioned in your previous question. How do you see Singapore as a services and a trade-focused country staying competitive strategically in this new age of technology so that it stays as an economic powerhouse, that is?
Ma'am.
Thank you, President. Especially thankful for your attitude towards the One China policy in the region of mainland China and Taiwan. So my question is, what would be the concrete plan for you to help invest in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of the sustainable development, especially for transitioning instead of pure green industry? Thank you.
Sir.
Hello, Mr. Zakaria. Hello, Mr. President. My name is Hari, and I'm a graduate student in the School of Engineering. Firstly, I'd like to say it was a very insightful talk. And I'm from Chennai, India. So on a personal note, it's an honor to meet you, Mr. President, as a fellow Tamilian. My question to you is, considering the long-standing and strong economic ties, as well as cultural ties between India and Singapore, how do you think our country's relationship can help show the world how to promote a multicultural society, cultural plurality, and ultimately establish a multipolar society? Thank you.
Super. That is the time we have, and Tharman, you have 5 minutes.
Great. So again, I'll give you a few quick-fire responses. My sense is that AI will be a big net plus for Singapore. First, because going back to that challenge I was talking about enabling everyone in the workforce to be able to adjust. We're a small society, and we've got a way of organizing ourselves between government, businesses, unions, and individuals in the community, such that you can reach every individual. You can reach every individual, avail to them new courses or modules that give them new skills, and keep people moving in their careers. So we can organize the skills of the future, and in fact, we intend to do so. Second, Singapore's short of people. And AI is actually an enabler when you're short of people, because it replaces many jobs that Singaporeans are not particularly keen on doing, are not very good at doing either. We don't have enough people doing coding and programming, for instance. And AI is taking over the world of coding and programming, just to give you an example. Thirdly, I think the pace of change is just going to, pace of innovation is going to increase in every sector because of AI. And what Singapore's real strength has to be, as a society and an economy, is to be one of the places in the world where you can very quickly adopt the latest innovations. You don't need to be there at the frontier creating the breakthrough technologies. A lot of it is going to come from Silicon Valley and other major hubs. Some of it will come from Singapore. But Singapore has to be very quick off the mark as a place where you can adopt new technologies and make what is conceptually interesting, commercially viable. Africa, I would say a major opportunity is actually in agri-food. The world is going to run into a food crisis, and it requires rethinking agriculture in both Africa and South Asia, where it has been left largely unchanged, remarkably, for decades now. If you look at levels of productivity in agriculture or the yields for the same crops in India or Sub-Saharan Africa or Pakistan or compared to the United States, it's just a vast difference, a vast difference. Even systems of irrigation are centuries old. The way in which we grow staples like rice are centuries old. So this is an opportunity to revolutionize agriculture so that it becomes a cash crop and an export crop. Farmers' incomes are improved, and we address the challenges of the global commons. Stop wasting so much water and disposing of polluted water because it contains fertilizer. So it's a real opportunity in Africa. And I'm just talking about the agri-food industry, but there are other opportunities as well in manufacturing and in logistics. Africa is still very disaggregated and not integrated. The African Free Trade Area, it's got a longer acronym, I forget, but it's basically an African Free Trade Area, has been slow in the uptake, and it really needs to be given a lot more attention. One last question was there a last question?
India.
In India, yeah. So Singapore and India have of course, a very strong historical relationship, deep. I mean, India and Southeast Asia have deep cultural commonalities. Our economic relationship is booming. Singapore is one of the largest investors in India, actually the largest foreign investor in India. It's a country that you want to be in. So we are both strategically and because of the natural market of entrepreneurial activity, we are deeply plugged into China, India, Southeast Asia, and the United States. We are plugged into each of these major regions, apart from Europe. And we intend to keep it that way. And it means constant engagement in India, in China, and in the rest of the world. Singapore has to work hard. It has to work hard, keep looking outward, and keep understanding the needs and the mores of the societies that you're operating in.
Mr. President, thank you so much. I'm going to ask the Dean of SIPA, Dean Yarhi-Milo, to come up and just say a few words to close this out.
And please join me in once again thanking our guest, our speaker, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to Fareed Zakaria for leading this wonderful conversation and terrific questions from our students. Thank you so much. What a privilege it was to hear from two innovative thinkers who have built their careers challenging conventional wisdoms. We've seen this today. We're really honored to have them both here. I'm Keren Yarhi-Milo. I'm the Dean of SIPA, the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. And today's discussion could not have been any timelier. As you could see, It is after events like these that I feel a real renewed sense of hope for the future and our collective ability to meet this moment that we are in. And I want to thank President Shafik and the World Leaders Forum for their partnership in putting together this wonderful event, together with SIPA's Institute of Global Politics, IGP. IGP, which we formally launched this fall, October 3rd, it looks like a long time ago, but it was only a month and a half ago, aims to drive real-world impact by convening scholars and practitioners, academics and policymakers, and developing policy solutions to solve the greatest challenges the world is facing. And training the next generation of leaders, and many of you are here with, as I said, with excellent questions. And hearing from a dignitary like President Tharman, who holds a PhD and is in elected office at home, and an international citizen who has served as a member of the committees and the boards of the IMF, the G20, and the UN, very much reflects our mission. And what really comes through in conversations like this evening's is that we are living in uncertain times. We need more leaders, like our guests today, leaders committed to building more inclusive social compacts, lifting up young people and opposing polarization. And this is how we can halt the erosion of rule-based order. And we have a lot of work to do. We will be hosting many similar thought-provoking discussions like this one and IGP in the next weeks and months. And please visit us online and learn more about what we do. And with that, I want to extend a final thank you to our speakers and to all of you for coming and sharing this evening with us. Thank you very much.
Tharman.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So,
That was fantastic.